The letter was still clutched in Cora Ford's fist when she stepped off the stagecoach into the blinding New Mexico sun, 3 children clinging to her skirts and dust rising around her boots like the whole territory was trying to swallow her whole. She had not cried yet. She had promised herself that much. Not when she read the telegram. Not when she packed the trunk. Not when little Eliza had asked, for the 4th time in as many days, when Mama was coming back. Cora had not cried, because if she started, she was not at all certain she would ever stop. The town of Redemption, New Mexico, population 432, looked exactly as desperate as its name suggested. A single main street of sun-baked buildings, a water trough that needed filling, a general store with a faded sign, and a man standing at the far end of the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that told her he had been expecting someone quite different. Daniel Hunter was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending too many years under a merciless sun. He was 34 years old, she knew from the letters, though those letters had been addressed to her sister, not to her. He had deep brown eyes set beneath dark brows, and right now those eyes were moving from Cora's face to the 3 small children pressed against her and back again, with an expression she could not quite name. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was something rawer than either of those things, something that looked almost like grief meeting grief across the space of 30 feet. He had written to her sister Margaret, who was dead. Margaret, who had answered his advertisement for a wife in the Santa Fe Gazette 6 months ago, and had spent those months exchanging letters with this man about her hopes and her plans, and the life she intended to build. Margaret, who had contracted typhoid fever in the final weeks of her pregnancy and died taking her newborn with her, leaving behind 3 children from her first marriage, ages 7, 5, and 3, and leaving behind a younger sister who had buried 2 babies of her own and whose arms had never felt so empty as they did right now, standing in the blinding noon light of Redemption, New Mexico, on the 20th day of June, 1882. Cora had not meant to come. She had meant to write a letter. She had meant to explain, to apologize, to send his correspondence back unopened, and let this man find his wife somewhere else. But then she had looked at Eliza, 7 years old and pretending to be brave, and at Thomas, 5 years old and clutching a wooden horse that had been his father's, and at little Ruth, 3 years old and still sometimes calling out for a mother who was not there, and she had realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she had no one else. No family left, no money, no home that was hers. And this man had a ranch, and he had written letters full of decency and honesty, and something that had felt, even reading them second-hand, like genuine longing for a real life. So she had come. She had come with her sister's children and her own empty arms, and she had not told him any of it in advance because she had been terrified that if she did, he would simply write back and say no. And she needed him to say yes. God help her, she needed someone to say yes to all of it. He walked toward her now, boots quiet on the packed dirt, and she forced herself to stand straight. She was 27 years old. She had survived enough to know that collapsing in the middle of a street solved nothing. She waited until he was close enough that she could see the dust on his shirt collar and the fine lines beside his mouth before she spoke. "Mr. Hunter," she said, "I am Cora Ford, Margaret's sister. I know this is not what you were expecting, and I know I owe you a full explanation, and I intend to give you one, but first I need to know whether there is somewhere these children can sit down out of this sun and have a drink of water, because Ruth has been on a stagecoach for 3 days, and she is too tired to tell you so herself." He looked at Ruth, who was indeed swaying slightly on her feet, one small hand wound so tightly in Cora's skirt that her knuckles had gone white. He looked back at Cora, and then Daniel Hunter did something she had not anticipated. He crouched down to Ruth's eye level right there in the middle of the street, and he said, in a voice that was quiet and unhurried, "Well, Miss Ruth, I have got a whole pitcher of cold water at my ranch, and I believe my housekeeper made a pie this morning. Do you think you could manage a ride in a wagon for about 20 minutes? Ruth stared at him. She sniffled once. And then she nodded, very seriously, the way 3-year-olds nodded when they were trying to seem older than they were. Daniel Hunter stood back up and met Cora's eyes. His expression was unreadable, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady and measured and utterly without cruelty. "My wagon is over here," he said. "We will talk when the children are settled." She followed him. She had no other choice, and she was not entirely certain in that moment that she would have chosen differently even if she had. The ranch was called the Copper Creek Ranch, named for the small creek that ran along its northern boundary and caught the afternoon light in a way that made the water look hammered and warm. It was not a grand spread, but it was solid. The kind of property that a man had built himself, carefully, one fence post and one season at a time. There was a main house, a bunkhouse where 2 ranch hands lived, a stable with 4 horses, and a kitchen garden that was doing its best in the dry heat. A woman named Mrs. Aguilar, round-faced and efficient, came out to meet them and took one look at the 3 children, and immediately swept Ruth up onto her hip, and beckoned the other 2 inside with the particular authority of a woman who had raised children of her own, and knew what tired looked like. Cora stood in the yard and watched her nieces and nephew disappear through the kitchen door with a stranger, and the exhaustion of the last 3 weeks hit her all at once with an almost physical force. She pressed her hand flat against the side of the wagon to steady herself and breathed. "Mrs. Ford," Daniel said, and she noticed that he had given her the courtesy of the married title even though she was not in fact married. She had been briefly, 4 years ago, a marriage that had lasted long enough to break her heart twice over before her husband's horse threw him, and the matter was decided by fate rather than by any human choice. She had kept the name. It was easier than explaining. "Miss," she corrected automatically. "I am not widowed. I am unmarried. My name was Ford before and it is still Ford. I only go by Miss, or you may call me Cora if that is easier." He absorbed this without visible reaction. "Cora, then," he said, "come inside. I will put coffee on and you can tell me everything." The front room of the house was spare but not cold. There was a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 6 chairs, 2 windows facing south, and a set of shelves that held what appeared to be a genuine collection of books, which surprised her. She had not expected books. The floor was clean. The curtains were plain cotton, but they were hemmed neatly, and someone had put a jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, which made her chest ache in a way she could not entirely explain. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table and she told him everything. She told him about Margaret, her older sister by 4 years, the one who had always been braver and louder and more certain of herself, who had married at 19 and loved her husband fiercely, and lost him to a mining accident when Ruth was barely a year old. She told him how Margaret had placed the advertisement herself, had corresponded with Daniel over 6 months, had made her plans with the particular determined optimism that had always been her most defining quality. She told him about the fever, how fast it had moved, how Margaret had been gone before any of them had truly believed she would not recover. She told him about the baby, a boy who had not survived the night after his mother. She told him about her own marriage, the brief terrible hope of it, the 2 pregnancies that had ended too soon, the grief that had settled into her bones so completely that she sometimes forgot what it had felt like before it was there. She told him that her husband, James, had died 3 years ago, that she had been living quietly in Albuquerque since then, on very little money and very little prospect. She told him that when Margaret died, she had become the only family those 3 children had in the world. She told him all of it without crying, because she had made herself a promise. Daniel Hunter listened to all of it without interrupting. He poured coffee. He set a cup in front of her. He sat across the table with his large hands wrapped around his own cup and his face very still and his eyes never leaving hers, and when she finally stopped talking he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How old are you?" 27, she said. "I am 34, he said. "I am not a wealthy man, but I am a solvent one." I have been working this land for 8 years, and I know what I am doing with it. I wanted a wife because I have been alone long enough and I wanted a family." He paused. He looked down at his coffee and then back up at her. "I wrote to your sister because her letter told me she was a woman who knew her own mind and was not afraid of hard work. I did not write to her because she was young or particularly beautiful or without history. I wrote to her because she sounded honest." Cora said nothing. Her throat was tight. "You came here," he said, "instead of writing to explain, instead of letting me simply find another advertisement and another woman. You came here with 3 children who needed somewhere to go, and you told me the truth about all of it to my face." He looked at her steadily. "That tells me something about the kind of woman you are." "It tells you I was desperate," she said flatly. "It tells me you were brave," he said. "Those are not always different things." He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard for a moment, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the way he held himself, still and contained, a man who felt things carefully. "I will not pretend this is exactly what I had in mind," he said. "But I will also not pretend that 3 children without a mother is something I can simply walk away from." He turned back to face her. "I have a proposal for you." She waited. "Stay," he said. "Let us see if this can work. Not a rushed arrangement, not a forced marriage for appearances. Stay here for a reasonable time. Let the children settle. Let us get to know each other honestly. If at the end of that time we both agree it makes sense, then we can make it formal. If not, I will help you find another situation. But I am not sending you back to nothing with 3 children in tow." Cora looked at him for a long time. She thought about the empty room she had left behind in Albuquerque. She thought about little Ruth asking for her mother in the dark. She thought about what she had been carrying since James died, since the second baby was lost, the particular weight of a life that had been full of love and full of loss in almost equal measure, and the way she had started to believe, somewhere along the way, that the loss was permanent and the love was done with her. "Why?" she said. "You do not know me. You had an agreement with my sister. You could wait a month and find someone with fewer complications." Daniel Hunter looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, very simply, "Because you are already here and so are they, and the room is there. I see no reason to pretend otherwise." She did not cry. But it was the closest she had come in 3 weeks. She said yes. The first days were strange. The way all transitions were strange. Cora was careful and precise in a way that she knew came across as cool, and she watched Daniel with the particular wariness of a woman who had been betrayed by hope before, and intended to understand what she was dealing with before she allowed herself to feel too much of anything. She helped Mrs. Aguilar in the kitchen. She managed the children's routines with the clockwork efficiency of someone who had nothing else to anchor herself to, and she tried to take up as little space as possible. Daniel noticed. She could tell he noticed because he did not push, but he made small and deliberate gestures that she could not help but observe. He fixed the loose board on the front step without being asked, which was the step she used every morning when she came out to hang the washing. He brought back a small carved horse from town that was similar enough to Thomas's old one that the boy's eyes went wide with surprise when it appeared beside his breakfast plate. He asked Eliza, seriously and without condescension, what she was reading, and then actually listened to her answer. One evening, about a week after Cora's arrival, she came out to the porch after the children were in bed and found him sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee and a book open across his knee. He looked up when the screen door opened, but did not speak immediately. She sat down on the step beside him, leaving a careful and proper distance between them, and they sat in silence for a while in the blue dark, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant call of an owl, the creak of the stable, the soft rustle of the wind through the dry grass. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "What did Margaret write to you, in the letters?" She paused. "I never read them, they were hers, but I wonder what she told you about herself, about what she wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "She wrote that she wanted a real home," he said. not a situation of convenience. She said she had been convenient once and it was not enough. She wanted someone who would talk to her honestly and treat her as a full person. She said she had 3 children who needed a father who was actually present. He turned his head and looked at Cora. She also wrote that she had a younger sister who was too stubborn for her own good and too good for the life she was living. Cora felt the breath leave her lungs. She said that. Her words, Daniel said. That her sister Cora was the strongest person she knew and the one most likely to convince herself she did not deserve anything good. The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against all the tender places. Cora looked out at the dark sky and the impossible scatter of stars and felt something shift in her chest, some small tectonic thing that had been held rigid for a very long time. She was not wrong, Cora said finally, very quietly. No, Daniel said. She was not. He did not reach for her hand. He did not say anything else. He simply sat beside her in the dark and let it be what it was, and she thought, with a kind of startled recognition, that this was a man who understood the weight of grief and did not try to fix it or rush it or explain it away. She did not know his story yet. She did not know what losses he had carried to this ranch on the edge of the New Mexico high desert, but she was beginning to understand that he had carried some. She began to ask him after that. In the mornings over coffee, or in the evenings on the porch, in the brief quiet moments between the endless practical business of a working ranch and 3 young children. She asked him about the ranch, how he had come to it, what he had built and why. She asked him about where he had come from, which was East Texas, a large, loud family and a homestead that had broken apart slowly under drought and debt, until the brothers scattered and Daniel had come west with $100 and a set of skills and a particular stubbornness that he did not apologize for. She asked him once on a warm afternoon while she was mending and he was cleaning tack at the table nearby whether he had ever been married before. He was quiet for a moment longer than usual. Engaged, he said, not married. She changed her mind 3 weeks before the date. He kept his eyes on the leather in his hands. She said the ranch was too far from town and the life was too quiet and she had been talked into it by her father and it was not what she actually wanted. How long ago? Cora asked. 5 years, he said. She thought about what that did to a person, that kind of ending. Not a catastrophe, not a death, just a quiet withdrawal of something you had planned your life around. She thought it was possibly harder in some ways than the things that ended loudly. You could not grieve a betrayal like that the way you grieved a death. It lived in a different, murkier place. I am sorry, she said. It was honest, he said. Better to know than to marry someone who did not truly want to be there. He looked up then briefly, and his eyes met hers. I always thought that. That honesty at the wrong moment is still worth more than a comfortable lie. She felt the words land somewhere important inside her, and she did not look away for a moment longer than was strictly proper. Thomas was the first one to truly take to Daniel. This was not entirely a surprise. Thomas was 5, old enough to watch and assess, young enough to be won over by practical demonstration, and Daniel had a natural ease with the boy that was not performed or effortful. He took Thomas to the stable one morning and showed him how to brush down one of the horses, a steady old bay mare named Clara who was so calm she practically slept through the process. Thomas came back to the house with his chest 4 inches wider and straw in his hair, and told Cora with complete seriousness that he had helped with the horses. You did, Daniel confirmed from behind him, utterly straight-faced. Eliza was more cautious. She was 7 and she was her mother's daughter, which meant she was perceptive and direct and not easily charmed. She watched Daniel the way Cora watched Daniel, with careful eyes and a tendency to ask the questions that were actually about something else underneath. One evening she asked him at dinner whether he had ever had any children. The table went briefly quiet. Mrs. Aguilar, who had stayed to help with the meal, became very interested in the bread. No, Daniel said with a steadiness that Cora admired. I have not. Do you want them? Eliza asked. Eliza, Cora said gently. It is a fair question, Daniel said. He looked at Eliza and answered her with the same seriousness she had offered. "Yes, I do. I think a house with children in it is something worth having." Eliza considered this. "We are not really your children," she said. "Not unkindly, just precisely." "That is true," Daniel said. "But that does not mean I cannot care what happens to you." He picked up his fork and resumed eating, and after a moment so did everyone else. Later that night, Cora passed Eliza's room and heard the girl say in the dark to her younger siblings in that small authoritative voice she used when she was settling something in her own mind, "He answered me straight. I think he means it." Cora stood in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against the wall, and something warm and frightening moved through her like current through a wire. She had been telling herself this was a practical arrangement. She had been telling herself she was being sensible, that she was doing what needed to be done for the children, that whatever she felt when Daniel looked at her or spoke to her or simply sat beside her in the quiet was incidental and not to be trusted. She had been very careful about not trusting it. But there in the hallway, listening to her niece decide to believe in someone, she could feel her own carefully constructed walls beginning, quietly and stubbornly, to crack. 3 weeks after Cora arrived, a man rode into redemption who made things complicated. His name was Garrett Prout, and he was the brother of Margaret's first husband, which made him technically an uncle to Eliza and Thomas and Ruth, which was precisely enough relationship to give him standing and not quite enough to give him authority. He was 31 years old, dark-featured, with an easy smile that did not quite make it to his eyes, and he arrived at the Copper Creek Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a letter from a lawyer in Albuquerque and an expression of deep and performative concern. He sat across from Cora at the table where she and Daniel had now taken to having their morning coffee together, and he told her that it had come to his family's attention that she had removed the children from New Mexico territory to an unknown location, which was not entirely true, and that the Prout family had concerns about the children's welfare and their upbringing, which Cora recognized immediately as the particular kind of legal language that preceded an attempt to exercise control. "They are Margaret's children," Cora said. "Margaret named me their guardian in her will." "She named you as guardian with the understanding that you were to arrange appropriate care," Garrett said, with a smile that was almost pleasant. "Not to take them to a stranger's ranch in the middle of nowhere." "This is not nowhere," Daniel said, from where he was standing near the fireplace, arms crossed, very still. "This is my home, and these children have been well fed and well cared for every day since they arrived." Garrett looked at Daniel with the careful assessment of a man measuring a rival. "You are the man who had a mail-order arrangement with the deceased," he said. "I am the man who offered these children a home," Daniel said, "which I understand to be the relevant fact." "The Prout family," Garrett said, turning back to Cora with that practiced smile, "would like to propose that the children be brought back to Albuquerque, where they have family and community and a life they know. My mother would be happy to take them in." Cora felt the particular cold that had been Margaret's secret gift to her, the ability to become very still and very clear in moments that were designed to knock her sideways. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Garrett Prout without expression. "Your mother is 63 years old and in poor health," she said. "Margaret told me so herself in the last letter she ever wrote. The children are settled here. They are beginning to sleep through the night again. Ruth has started calling this ranch her house, and Thomas brushed a horse yesterday like it was the most natural thing in the world." She paused. "I will not uproot them again for the comfort of a family that has shown no interest in them until now, when there is a property settlement to consider." Garrett's smile cooled. "That is an uncharitable interpretation." "It is an accurate one," Cora said. "And if your family's lawyer wants to contest Margaret's will, they are welcome to do so in the appropriate court. I will be represented." After he left, riding away down the long dirt track toward the main road with his horse moving at a frustrated clip, Cora sat very still at the table and let herself shake for a moment. Just for a moment. the way she sometimes allowed herself to do in the immediate aftermath of things that had required her to be immovable. Daniel sat down across from her. He did not tell her she had done well or that she was brave because he had already learned, or she thought he had already learned, that she did not need to be managed. He said, "Do you have the will documents?" "In my trunk," she said. "Good," he said. "I know a lawyer in Santa Fe who is straightforward and experienced with family matters. I will write to him today." He paused. "If the Pruitts try to move on this through the courts, I want you to have someone in your corner before they do." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "It is not a question of would," he said. "Of course I will." She thought about hidden motives. She had learned in the years of her marriage and the harder years after to look for them in generous gestures, to ask what someone expected in return for their help. She looked at Daniel Hunter across the table in the morning light and searched for the dark calculation she had trained herself to find, and she did not find it. What she found instead was something so straightforward and so unperformed that it frightened her more than the Pruitts' lawyer ever could. She found a man who simply meant what he said. The week after Garrett Pruitt's visit, Daniel took Cora riding. It was a Saturday, the first day in weeks when the practical weight of everything had lifted enough to allow for something that was not urgency, and Mrs. Aguilar was at the ranch with the children, who were happily occupied with the remains of a pie and a set of alphabet blocks that Daniel had brought back from town. He saddled 2 horses, the bay mare Clara for Cora and a larger gray gelding named Scout for himself, and they rode north along the creek in the long golden light of the late afternoon. She had grown up on horseback before the years in Albuquerque, and she found the motion of it immediately natural, the way certain things come back to the body without effort. She rode beside him along the creek bank and felt some of the relentless tension in her shoulders begin slowly to ease. He showed her the northern boundary of the ranch, a line of fence posts he had put in himself, and then the place where the creek widened into a shallow pool that caught the sky and held it. They stopped there and let the horses drink, and the silence was full and warm and entirely comfortable, and Cora realized with a small shock of recognition that she could not remember the last time silence had felt comfortable. "This is my favorite part of the land," Daniel said. He was looking at the water, his voice easy and quiet. "When I first came here and was trying to decide whether to stay, I rode out to this spot and I sat here for about an hour. Something about the light on the water." He paused. It felt like the kind of place a life could happen. She understood that immediately. It was the kind of sentence that could have been sentimental and was not, because it was simply true. "You make good decisions," she said. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "I have made some poor ones too." "Everyone has," she said. "I am talking about the ones that brought you here." She looked at the water. "You could have stayed in Texas. You could have done any number of things. Instead, you came to this specific piece of land and you stayed and you built something that is yours." "I want it to be more than mine," he said. The words were careful and deliberate, not rushed, and she understood that he was saying them to her specifically and on purpose. She turned to look at him. He was looking back at her with those steady brown eyes and the afternoon light on his face, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been cracking since the night on the porch crack open a little further. "Daniel," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not trying to rush you. I only wanted you to know that it is not a performance. This is not a calculated arrangement for me. Not anymore." He looked back at the water. "Maybe it started that way, the advertisement, the letters, that is all practical enough. But you have been here 3 weeks and I have watched you with those children every single day. And I have watched you stand up to Garrett Pruitt like you were made of iron. And I have watched you sit on the porch after everyone is in bed and let yourself breathe for exactly 5 minutes before you start thinking about tomorrow's list of things to be done." He turned back to her. "You are not convenient to care about, Cora Ford. You are the most complicated person I have met. And I find that I do not care about convenient anymore." She was quiet for a long time. The creek moved over the stones and the horses shifted in the shallows and the sky deepened toward the long, slow New Mexico dusk. She thought about what it meant to trust this. She thought about what it would cost her if she was wrong. She thought about Margaret's words in Daniel's voice, her sister's voice, too stubborn for her own good and too good for the life she was living. "I lost 2 babies," she said, not because it was the only thing she could have said, but because it was the true thing, the hidden thing, the one she had not said out loud to another person in years. "My marriage to James was not easy, but I wanted it to be, and what I wanted most from it was the children, and I lost both of them, before they were born. And then James died, and I have spent 3 years telling myself that the empty part of me was just the way I was now, that some things that break do not go back together." He did not say that it would be different, that she would have more children, that everything happened for a reason. She was deeply grateful for that. He said, "I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry. That is more than one person should have to carry." "I am all right," she said, because it was partially true. "I know you are," he said. "That is what I am saying. You are all right, and you have been carrying it anyway, and you have not let it make you cruel or closed." He paused. "You let those children in, even when it hurt to. Even knowing that loving them meant grieving their mother, you let them in anyway." She pressed her lips together and looked at the water. When she spoke, her voice was entirely level, and she was proud of it. "I did not know I had a choice," she said. "You always had a choice," he said softly. "You just made the right one." She looked at him. The sun was almost at the horizon, and the water was the color of hammered copper, just as the creek's name had always promised. She reached across the small distance between their horses, and she put her hand over his where it rested on his saddle, and she held it there for a moment. Just that, just the warmth of it, just the simple fact of it. He turned his hand over and held hers back. They rode home in the dusk with their horses walking side by side, and the silence between them changed now, softer, fuller, like a room that has been aired out and let the light in after a long time closed. The letter from the Santa Fe lawyer arrived on a Thursday and was everything Daniel had told her to expect. The Pruitts had indeed filed a petition, arguing that Cora's guardianship was irregular and that the children should be returned to Albuquerque for proper placement with blood family. The lawyer, a man named Harmon Price, wrote that the petition had merit on paper but several significant weaknesses in substance, and that the court would want to see evidence of the children's current welfare and the stability of their living situation. Cora read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and was very quiet for a moment. Daniel was watching her from across the table. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need the court to see that these children are stable and safe and settled," she said. "Which they are, but a woman alone on a ranch she arrived at 3 weeks ago looks different than a married woman with an established home." She paused. She kept her voice very matter-of-fact. "I want you to know that I am not saying this as a pressure. I am not trying to force your hand. I would rather lose this case than have you feel that I have trapped you into something." "Cora," he said. "I mean it," she said, and her voice was harder than she intended, the particular hardness that came from having needed things too badly before and having been left holding the weight of that need alone. "I am telling you the legal reality. I am not asking you to marry me because of it." "I know you are not," he said. He looked at her steadily. "Which is why I am going to tell you that I was already going to ask you. Not because of any legal petition, not because of the children's welfare, not because it solves a problem. I was going to ask you because I want to. Because this has become real to me in a way I did not anticipate and did not plan for and am not interested in pretending has not happened." He paused. "But I also want to do this right. I do not want to ask you at a kitchen table over a lawyer's letter. I want to ask you in a way that means something." She looked at him. "I would answer the same either way," she said. "You should know that." "I know," he said, "but you deserve to have it done properly." He asked her that evening on the porch, which was where the important conversations between them happened, as if the porch existed outside of the ordinary structure of days, and all the weight they carried could be set down there. The children were asleep. The stars were the kind of complete and breathtaking that they only were on clear desert nights when there was no moon to compete with them. He stood up from his seat and held out his hand, and when she took it, he looked at her in that steady, unhurried way of his and said, "Cora Ford, I know this is not the life either of us originally planned for. I know you came here carrying more than any one person should, and I know you have reasons not to trust easily. I am not asking you to trust the idea of us. I am only asking you to trust me specifically, which I believe you have already been doing." He paused. "Will you marry me? Not for the children, not for the ranch, for me and for you and for whatever we are building together, which is something I believe in." She stood on the porch of the Copper Creek Ranch in the New Mexico night and felt the last remnant of the wall around her heart give way, quietly and completely, like a fence line that had held as long as it needed to. "Yes," she said, "for exactly those reasons." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, and it was old-fashioned and formal and entirely sincere, and she thought she had never been kissed so carefully in her life. They were married on the 4th of August, 1882, in the small white-painted church on the edge of Redemption, New Mexico, by a minister named Reverend Cole, who was clearly delighted to have a ceremony to perform. Mrs. Aguilar cried. Thomas stood very straight in a clean shirt that he had informed everyone 3 separate times was not itchy. Eliza held Ruth's hand and watched the whole proceedings with calm, serious eyes that made Cora think she was going to grow up to be either a judge or a school teacher, possibly both. Daniel wore a clean dark jacket that Cora had not seen before, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle between the church pews, with an expression that she did not have a word for because it was not any single simple thing. It was full of something, some convergence of relief and joy and gravity and longing, and it made her hands tremble slightly, which she found slightly exasperating because she had expected to be perfectly composed, and she was not quite. Reverend Cole read from the scriptures and asked them to make their promises, and when Daniel said his, he said them quietly and directly to her face, not performing them for the congregation but meaning them specifically and solely for her, and she said hers back the same way. When he kissed her at the end, it was brief and warm and utterly, wholly real, and the children clapped, Thomas enthusiastically and Ruth with the slightly bewildered rhythm of a child who was following social cues she did not quite understand, and Eliza did not clap but she smiled, which Cora thought was worth considerably more. The Prout petition came before the court in Santa Fe in September, and Harmon Price argued it with the particular confidence of a lawyer who knew his ground. He had prepared a thorough account of the children's welfare, their health, their schooling, their daily life on the ranch, and their adjustment since arriving. He had affidavits from Mrs. Aguilar and from the minister who had performed the ceremony, and from 2 of the Redemption townspeople who had met the children and could attest to their state. He had a letter from the county doctor, confirming all 3 children were healthy and well-nourished. The Prout family's lawyer argued that blood ties were significant and that the move to New Mexico had been made without proper consent. Harmon Price countered that Margaret's will was clear and properly executed, and that Cora's guardianship was legal and appropriate, and that the children's evident welfare and stability counted far more than the Prouts' belated interest. The judge, a weathered man of 50 with reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose, listened to both sides and then asked a number of questions, including several about the children themselves, which Cora thought spoke well of him. He ruled in Cora's favor on all substantive points, noting that the children had a stable, legally established home, that their guardian was married and resident, and that there was no material argument that their welfare would be better served by uprooting them again to live with an elderly relative in uncertain health. Garrett Prout, sitting on the other side of the courtroom, did not look at Cora when the ruling was read. He picked up his hat and walked out, and she watched him go and felt the particular complicated feeling of a victory that was also a closing of a door. Those children shared blood with the Prouts. That would not change. She did not want them to grow up thinking they had been fought over like property, and she did not want this to be the permanent shape of things. Outside the courthouse, she took a moment to breathe the cool September air before Daniel came to stand beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Are you all right?" "I am relieved," she said. "And I am also aware that Garrett Prout is not a monster. He is just a man who does not know how to ask for things properly." She looked at the courthouse steps and then at Daniel. "I am going to write to him, not to be warm but to be clear. Those children know who their father was. He was a Prout. I am not going to pretend that is nothing. But I am going to tell him exactly how it will work, which is on my terms and theirs." "That is exactly right," Daniel said. "I know," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I occasionally am." He laughed at that, a real and unguarded laugh, and she thought it was one of the most handsome things about him, the way he laughed when something truly struck him, openly and without calculation. Autumn on the Copper Creek Ranch was a particular kind of beauty that Cora had not anticipated. The light changed in September to something golden and slanted, and the mornings were cool in a way that made the coffee taste better, and the air smell of dry grass and turned earth. She had her own life now, genuinely and specifically hers, and she took to it with the same careful attention she brought to everything, learning the rhythms of the land and the seasons, the particular needs of this stretch of New Mexico desert that was now her home. She and Daniel worked side by side in the evenings after the children were in bed, going over the ranch accounts or the season's plans, or simply reading in the same room, comfortable with the parallel presence of each other in a way that felt to her like a kind of profound rest. She had not known that a person could rest in another person's company. She had known love that was urgent and love that was desperate and love that was terrified, but she had not known this, the steady and unhurried warmth of a man who was simply glad she was in the room. He taught her to read weather from the clouds, which formations meant a dry spell, and which meant a change coming, because the weather on the ranch affected everything and she wanted to know everything. She taught him a card game that her father had taught her, and they played it on Friday evenings after dinner in a spirit of extremely competitive good humor that the children eventually begged to observe, sitting at the ends of their chairs with wide eyes, while Cora and Daniel argued with great seriousness about the rules. She wrote her letter to Garrett Prout in October, 3 precise pages that were not unfriendly but were entirely clear. She told him that the children knew their father's name and their father's people, that they would not be raised in ignorance of that part of themselves. She said that if he or his family wished to be part of their lives in a way that served the children's well-being, she would not prevent that, but that any approach had to be direct and honest and not through lawyers. She sent it and did not think about it again, because she had done what was right and the rest was up to him. He wrote back in November. The letter was shorter than hers and less eloquent, but its essential message was that he had perhaps moved too fast and too aggressively, and that he recognized the children were well settled, and that he would like, if she was amenable, to correspond occasionally and perhaps visit in the spring. She showed Daniel the letter. He read it and handed it back and said that it seemed sincere. She agreed, and she wrote back that a spring visit was acceptable, and she meant it. The winter of 1882 to 1883 came in hard, the first December cold bringing snow to the upper elevation and dropping temperatures on the ranch to bitter lows. Cora, who had spent the last 3 years in Albuquerque's more moderate climate, found herself fascinated and slightly alarmed by the severity of it. The children were delighted. Ruth, who had turned 4 in November, experienced her first real snow with a joy so pure and physical that it made all the adults who witnessed it involuntarily grin. Thomas, now 6, had appointed himself Daniel's unofficial assistant on all matters of ranch maintenance, a role he took with extreme seriousness. He followed Daniel through the daily checks with a small notebook that he occasionally wrote things in, though whether the marks he made were letters or simply decoration was unclear. Daniel treated the notebook with complete respect and occasionally consulted it in Thomas's presence. asking him to check what they had recorded last week about the amount of feed. And Thomas would peer at his marks and report with great authority, and Daniel would nod as though this was useful information. Cora watched this one afternoon from the kitchen window, Daniel and Thomas moving through the cold together, their breath making small clouds in the December air, Thomas's short legs working fast to keep up with Daniel's longer stride. And something happened in her chest that she recognized as love, the specific and overwhelming variety that came with witnessing a kindness that asked nothing in return. She turned away from the window and went back to the bread she was making and stood at the kitchen table with her hands in the dough and cried, quietly, for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach in June. Not from grief, not exactly, though grief was in it. From the full and inexplicable weight of having been given, against every expectation, something real. When Daniel came in from the cold that evening, she was herself again, entirely composed, dinner on the table and Ruth helping to fold napkins in her approximate and enthusiastic way. He came to stand beside her at the kitchen counter and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," she said. He studied her for a moment with those eyes that had always seen too clearly. "Did something happen?" "I watched you with Thomas this afternoon," she said. She kept her voice even and her face turned to the counter. "I have been waiting, I suppose, for the part where this stops being true, where it turns out to be a kindness that runs out or a performance with a purpose behind it. I have been waiting for 6 months." She paused. "It has not." He put his hand on her back, warm and steady, and left it there. "It will not," he said simply. She believed him. That was the thing that had changed, she realized. Not that he had said something convincing, but that she had reached a point where she was willing to believe it. That whatever had broken in her all those years ago had been knit back together, slowly and without ceremony, in a ranch house in the New Mexico desert by a man who answered questions straight and kept his word. January passed in the particular rhythm of a winter ranch, the days short and cold and full of necessary work. In February, Cora began to suspect something that she was almost afraid to name. She had been here before, this particular feeling, the particular way the mornings went, and she had been wrong about it before in the most painful way possible. She waited until she was certain enough to say it aloud. She told Daniel on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table while the children were still asleep and the early light was silver through the south windows. She told him with her hands around her coffee cup and her voice very quiet and very level. He was entirely still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," she said, "but I believe so. I will know more definitively in another few weeks." He reached across the table and took her hand very gently, the way he had taken it at the creek 7 months ago. "How are you feeling?" "Frightened," she said honestly. "I want to tell you that I am not, but I am." "Of course you are," he said. "You have every reason to be." He held her hand. "But you are also healthy and strong, and we are going to take care of you, every step." He paused. "I am going to find you the best doctor in the territory. I do not care about the cost." "Daniel," she said. "I mean it," he said. "Not because I doubt you, because I refuse to leave anything to chance that does not have to be." She looked at him and thought about dark pasts and the particular way they were supposed to determine the future. The way she had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that the things that had gone wrong for her were simply the shape of her life. She thought about the empty arms that she had arrived with, and the fullness that had come quietly and relentlessly in the months since. "All right," she said. "Find me your best doctor." He did. The doctor came from Santa Fe in March, a competent and thorough woman named Dr. Estrada who had trained in Philadelphia before coming west, and who told Cora that she was in excellent health and that everything appeared to be progressing well. She came monthly after that, the arrangement costing more than was strictly practical, but Daniel having decided without discussion that it was not a negotiable point. Eliza, who had turned 8 in February with a quiet dignity that made Cora think she had skipped a large portion of childhood altogether, figured it out herself in April, with the perceptiveness of a child who had watched adults carefully all her short life. She came to Cora in the garden one afternoon when the spring was finally making its way into the air, and she said, "You are going to have a baby." Cora looked up from the seedlings she was placing. "Yes," she said. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" "A little," Cora said. Eliza sat down on the low garden wall. She was quiet for a moment more, and then she said, "Mama was scared too, when she was carrying Ruth. She told me." She looked at her hands. "I think it is all right to be scared. I think it does not mean something bad will happen." Cora set down the seedling and went and sat beside her niece on the garden wall and put her arm around the girl's narrow shoulders. "When did you get so wise?" she said. "I have always been wise," Eliza said, with the particular matter-of-fact quality that was entirely her own. "You are just paying attention now." Cora laughed, genuinely and freely, and hugged her, and Eliza allowed it with the slightly stiff tolerance of a girl who considered herself too old for hugging, but recognized that this was an exception. The spring brought other good things. Garrett Prout did indeed visit in April, a visit that was cautious and slightly awkward for the first hour, and then settled into something more honest. He was, Cora realized, not unlike what she had initially been, someone who needed things but did not quite know how to ask for them properly. He brought the children small gifts that were thoughtful rather than extravagant. He sat at the dinner table and answered their questions about their father, who had been his older brother, and there were moments when his face went through something that was plainly grief and plainly real. Daniel was present for the visit without being intrusive, which was exactly right. He was polite and direct and not territorial, because he was a man secure enough not to need to be territorial. When Garrett left at the end of the day, he shook Daniel's hand and said, stiffly but sincerely, "You have a good home here." "We do," Daniel said. "Not I, we." The summer of 1883 was the warmest in Cora's memory, and she spent much of it in the particular physical reality of late pregnancy, which she met with her characteristic practical approach and a secret internal wonder that she did not speak about often because she was afraid of it. She let herself hope. She had not let herself hope before, not truly, not with her whole self, and she found that it was terrifying and extraordinary and that she could not be talked out of it. Daniel was, in these months, the kind of husband she had not known was available in the world. He was not fussy or anxious in a way that made her feel fragile. He was attentive in the specific practical ways that actually helped, making sure the water was brought in so she did not have to carry it, riding into town himself when things were needed, taking the children on the evening tasks with a cheerful efficiency that let her rest without guilt. He talked to her every evening the way he always had, treating her as a full and capable person who was also, incidentally and temporarily, carrying something precious and being accordingly thoughtful about it. She told him once on the porch in the summer heat that she had not expected this. Expected what, he asked. "This kind of marriage," she said. "This specific kind, where I am still myself." He looked at her with something that was almost puzzlement. What would be the point otherwise? She shook her head. "You would be surprised," she said, "or perhaps you would not." "I know there are men who think a wife is a more elaborate kind of property," he said, and his voice was flat in a way that told her exactly what he thought of that. "I have never understood it. A person is a person. A life is a life." She reached over and took his hand, as she had been doing for a year now, as easily and naturally as breathing. "A life is a life," she agreed. Their son was born on the 17th of August, 1883, and he was alive and loud and absolutely perfect. Dr. Estrada was there, as arranged, and the birth was long and not without difficulty, but it was the kind of difficulty that Dr. Estrada navigated with calm expertise, and at the end of it Cora was exhausted and intact, and there was a boy in her arms. A real living, breathing boy with dark hair and his father's stubbornness already evident in the set of his jaw. She heard Daniel's voice from the other side of the door, and then Dr. Estrada went to speak with him. And then the door opened, and he came in and crossed the room to where she was propped against the pillows with this small and astonishing creature in her arms. And he sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for a long moment with an expression that she thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never quite managing. He was crying, not loudly, not in a way that made demands on anyone, just quietly and without apology, the way a man cried when he had waited a long time for something and it had come at last. She reached up and touched his face, and he covered her hand with his and held it there. "Hello," she said quietly, to both of them. They named him James William Hunter. James for Cora's late husband, who had been imperfect and gone but had been part of her story, and William for Daniel's father, who had broken apart under drought and debt, but who had built the work ethic that had brought his son here. It was a name that honored two different pasts without pretending either of them had been simple. Eliza held him first after the parents with the focused and almost academic concentration she brought to everything, examining him the way she examined new specimens. "He is very wrinkled," she observed. "They are at first," Cora said. "He looks like Mr. Hunter," Thomas said. "He looks like himself," Eliza corrected firmly. "He has only just arrived. We should give him time to look like whoever he is." Ruth, at 4 years old, was most interested in whether the baby could talk yet, and upon being informed that he could not, she patted him very gently on the head and told him not to worry because she would teach him. The ranch in the summer of 1883 held, on any given evening, 5 people who had been broken and rearranged by the world and who had found, in this particular patch of New Mexico desert, something that fit together. It was not perfect. Eliza occasionally still went quiet in ways that had to be approached carefully and given time. Thomas sometimes woke from nightmares. Ruth still, sometimes, asked a question about her mother that landed in the room like something fragile. Cora still had days when the old grief came back not as a wave, but as a color, pervading everything without crashing into it. Daniel still had mornings when she could see the old loneliness in his face before the day filled up and pushed it back. But they talked about these things. That was the difference, she thought, from what she had known before. They talked about the hard things when they needed to. Daniel did not pretend to know what Cora's grief felt like, and she did not pretend that his quieter wounds did not exist. They had no secrets between them that were designed to protect. The ones they kept were the small private ones that every person kept, the places inside a self that were simply yours and not hidden but not owed. In October, Eliza started school in Redemption. She came home on the first day and reported with characteristic precision that the teacher, Mrs. Fontaine, was competent. The readers were slightly outdated but adequate, and there were 2 other children in her class who were worth knowing. Daniel asked her, with complete seriousness, what made them worth knowing. Eliza said one of them had read 3 of the same books she had, and the other one had asked a question in class that showed genuine critical thinking. Daniel nodded and said those were indeed good criteria. Cora, listening from the kitchen, thought with sudden clear certainty that she was happy. Not performed happiness, not the effort of making oneself feel something, but the real and unexpected arrival of it, that particular quality of warmth and rightness that settled into a life when it had been built on honest foundations. She carried little James out to the porch in the golden October afternoon and held him in her arms, this boy who was alive and here and real. And she let herself believe, fully and finally and without reservation, that the empty arms she had arrived with were empty no longer, and that the fullness was permanent, earned, and entirely hers. Daniel came to stand beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together on the porch of the Copper Creek Ranch and watched the light change on the land they had built together, the fence lines and the gardens and the stable where Thomas was probably already asking to brush Clara again. "What are you thinking?" he said. She turned her head and looked at him, this man who had made room for all of it, for her grief and her history and her borrowed children and her empty arms and her frightened heart, who had said simply, I see no reason to pretend otherwise and meant every word. I am thinking, she said, that Margaret would have been happy here. His arm tightened around her. She would have, he said, and I think, Cora said, that she would have been glad it was me, because she always thought I needed to be pushed. She was right, Daniel said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Do not tell her she was right, Cora said. She is insufferable enough. They both knew what she was doing, talking about Margaret in the present tense just for a moment, just to give her the shape of presence again. It was something Cora did occasionally, a way of keeping her sister real rather than abstract, a woman who had lived and loved and made choices that had changed everything, who deserved to be remembered as a person and not only as a loss. Daniel understood this without being told. He simply stood beside her and held the space for all of it, the grief and the joy and the complicated interweaving of the two, which was, Cora had come to understand, simply what it meant to have lived a full life. Winter came in again in November, and with it came a letter from the Prout family that surprised her. It was from Garrett's mother, the elderly woman whom Cora had expected to be hostile, and it was short and unadorned and said simply that she was glad to hear the children were well, that she would like a photograph if one could be arranged, and that she understood how things stood and respected it. Cora sat with the letter for a long time. Then she wrote back to say that yes, a photograph could certainly be arranged, and that the children would be glad to know their grandmother's family had not forgotten them. She had a photographer come from Redemption in the spring of 1884, a man named Mr. Leavitt with a bulky camera and a manner of extreme patience, which was necessary when dealing with 3 children, an infant, 2 adults, and a horse that Thomas had insisted on including. The resulting photograph, which required 4 attempts because Ruth kept turning away at the last moment, showed them all in the yard of the Copper Creek Ranch, a little stiff in the way of all early photographs, but together. Cora sent a copy to the Prouts and kept one on the mantelpiece, where it gathered company over the years. Young James Hunter, it turned out, had his mother's stubbornness and his father's steadiness and an additional quality all his own, a kind of blithe fearlessness that sent Cora's heart into her throat on a semi-regular basis. By the time he was 2 years old, he had climbed the fence rail twice, attempted to befriend a rattlesnake which had fortunately been a young and relatively unaggressive specimen, and informed Thomas, at length and with great authority, that the horse was his horse, which Thomas disputed, and the dispute became something of a standing institution in the family. Thomas, at 8, was serious and meticulous in ways that reminded Cora of Margaret, with a gift for mechanical things that had Daniel quietly talking about what it might mean for his future. He was a good boy with a capacity for deep concentration that expressed itself in building things, fixing things, understanding how things fit together. Eliza, at 10, had confirmed all of Cora's early assessments and added to them. She was reading at a level well above her years, and had recently developed a passionate interest in the history of the territory and the broader history of the land, asking questions about the peoples who had lived in New Mexico before the settlers arrived with a directness and moral seriousness that occasionally put adults on the defensive. Daniel had taken to answering her historical questions with books, ordered from Santa Fe and twice from a bookseller in Denver, because he said she asked the right questions and deserved real answers. Ruth, at 5, was all Margaret. There was no other way to put it. She was warm and bright and occasionally overwhelming, given to strong opinions about everything and a physical exuberance that meant the house was always slightly louder when she was in it. She had Margaret's laugh, which sometimes stopped Cora mid-breath, not in a painful way any longer, but in the way a beloved song did when you heard it unexpectedly. In the summer of 1884, Cora realized she was expecting again. She told Daniel in the garden while she was weeding, because she had learned with him that the location of important revelations did not have to be formal, that important things could be said anywhere between 2 people who trusted each other completely. He went still for a moment and then turned to her with a smile that was so openly and straightforwardly happy that she felt her own face immediately mirror it. "Really?" he said. "Really?" she said. He crossed the garden and kissed her, warm and unhurried, with the ease of two people who had been kissing for 2 years and had learned each other's particulars of it. Then he leaned his forehead against hers in the summer afternoon with the smell of the turned earth around them and the distant sound of Thomas arguing with James about the horse again, and he said, quietly, "This is a good life." "The best I have imagined," she said, "and I have a good imagination." He laughed, and she felt it against her face, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she had been right to come. That Margaret had been right about her. That stubbornness in the end had its uses. Their daughter was born in February of 1885, in the deep of a winter that had softened enough to let the sun through by the afternoon she arrived. They named her Margaret after the sister who had made all of it possible, the woman whose letters had built a bridge across a distance that Cora had eventually crossed herself, wearing her sister's hope like a coat she had borrowed and then grown into and finally made her own. Little Margaret had her grandmother Ford's red hair, which appeared on neither parent and caused considerable discussion, and her mother's habit of studying faces before she spoke. And she was, from the very beginning, adored by every person in the household, including Thomas, who had been prepared to be indifferent but was undone on day 3 by the specific fact that she seemed to prefer his voice to everyone else's for purposes of falling asleep. The family photograph taken in the spring of 1885, which included James at 18 months and Margaret at 2 months, and all 3 of the older children in their Sunday best and Daniel with his arm around Cora in a way that was not formal at all but warm and entirely natural, was the one that went to the Pruitts and to Daniel's family in Texas, and into the letter that Cora wrote to everyone she had ever known, not to boast, but because she had been in the habit of expecting the worst and she wanted to practice something different. Garrett Pruitt visited again that summer. He was different than he had been, softer at the edges, and he told Cora over coffee on the porch that he had married the previous autumn, a woman named Felicity, who was apparently nothing like any woman he had previously known, which he said with a rueful honesty that made Cora warm toward him considerably. He held little Margaret with the concentrated care of a man encountering infants for the first time and expressed deep respect for what he was managing. And Eliza quizzed him at dinner about his knowledge of the region's history, with a thoroughness that Cora considered only slightly excessive. When he left, he shook Daniel's hand and then unexpectedly turned to Cora and said, "I handled it badly. When I came before, I know I did. I want you to know I understand that now." "I know," she said, "and I want you to know that the children will always know who their father's people are. That will not change." He nodded, and it was a real nod, a settled one, and the chapter that had opened with his arrival 3 years before closed quietly and without ceremony. The fall of 1885 brought a drought that hit the territory hard, and the Copper Creek Ranch harder than most. A summer with not enough rain, and a fall with none. The creek dropping to a thin thread, and the cattle coming through the season leaner than Daniel liked. It was a hard year, the hardest they had faced together on the ranch, and it required everything: careful management of the resources, cutting of expenses, difficult decisions about which cattle to sell and when, long nights going over the figures and longer days doing the work. They did it together. That was the thing that Cora held onto when the worry was its worst. They did it together, side by side at the table with the account books and side by side in the field, and in the quiet evenings when the worry had to be set down for a few hours, or it would eat through everything. They talked through the hard decisions honestly, and they disagreed occasionally with the direct and respectful honesty that was their established way, and they came out on the right side of the season by the narrowest margin that Daniel said he ever intended to allow. The spring of 1886 brought good rain. It brought the creek back to its full voice, and the grass returning to the upper pasture, and a warmth in the air that felt like the land itself was relieved. Daniel stood at the fence line of the north pasture one April morning and watched the water move in the creek, and Cora came to stand beside him, and he said, "We made it," with a simple certainty that was not boasting but was something close to gratitude. "We made it," she agreed. She was expecting again. She had told him the week before, with the particular ease of a woman who had done this twice now, and trusted both the process and the man beside her. And he had held her, and said all the right things, and then gone outside and been quietly, visibly happy in the way he was when feelings were running high enough that they moved through the body, whether you intended them to or not. This baby, their second son, was born in September of 1886, healthy and immediate, and possessed of a set of lungs that little Margaret found deeply impressive. They named him Henry, for no reason more complicated than that they both liked the name, and they were done with large naming decisions, and the sound of it in the house was immediately right. The household in the fall of 1886 was the particular kind of beautiful chaos that Cora had not known to want and could not now imagine being without. Eliza at 12 was writing essays about territorial history that her teacher submitted to the Santa Fe newspaper, one of which was published, which she reported with careful composure, and then spent an entire evening rereading the published version. Thomas at 10 was building a mechanical irrigation device for the kitchen garden that Daniel said was entirely possible and mostly well designed. Ruth at 7 was teaching James, now 3, to read, with a patience and inventiveness that surprised everyone, including Ruth herself. Little Margaret at 18 months was walking and had opinions about everything. Henry at 2 weeks was feeding and sleeping on a schedule that seemed reasonable to everyone except himself. Cora sat at the kitchen table on a September evening with Henry asleep in the cradle beside her and the older children settled, and the ranch quiet in the way it was only after 8 o'clock, and Daniel came in from the last check of the evening and sat down across from her, and they looked at each other in the familiar warm light of the kitchen. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Wonderfully so," she said. "The kind of tired that means you have actually done something." He smiled. It was his real smile, the one that was not for public consumption but simply his. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the north pasture." "What about it?" "I want to expand the fence line," he said. "We have enough range to carry more cattle, and I think next year is the year to do it." He paused. "What do you think?" She knew the land well now. 3 years of riding it, working it, watching its seasons, had given her an understanding that went past intellectual and into something more like intuition. She thought for a moment about the north pasture, the water access, the grass quality, the practical implications. "I think you are right about the timing," she said. "I want to look at the water access first. If the creek had one dry year, it could have another." "Fair," he said. "We will ride out Saturday and look at it." She nodded, and they talked about it for another 20 minutes with the easy competence of two people who had been making decisions together for 4 years, and had learned to think well together. And then Henry made a small sound, and she picked him up, and Daniel came around to look at his son with that expression that never entirely lost its newness, the particular quality of wonder that was different from his everyday face, and he put his large hand on the baby's head very gently and said nothing. Because sometimes nothing was the most completely right thing. She had come here with her sister's children and her own empty arms and enough grief to fill a county, and this man had looked at all of it and found room. He had said so, plainly and without conditions, and he had meant it in a way that had turned out to be not a calculation or a convenient arrangement or a kindness with a limit, but simply the truth of who he was. She had been too stubborn for her own good, all her life, and too good for the life she was living, and it had taken a dead sister's love letter to a stranger and a stagecoach into the baking New Mexico sun, and 3 children clinging to her skirts to bring her to the porch of this ranch, and she was glad. With her whole self, without reservation, without waiting for the part where it went wrong, she was glad. She looked at Daniel Hunter over the head of their sleeping son, and she thought that she would tell him so. She would tell him exactly that plainly, because she had learned from him that plain truth between two people who trusted each other was the foundation of everything, and she would not take it for granted. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her. "I am glad I came," she said. "I want you to know that. Not for the children, and not because it worked out well, and not because I did not have other options, which I did not, but genuinely. For you, specifically. I am glad you were the one." His face went through something that she had seen before and never grew tired of, that particular movement that happened when he felt something too large for his ordinary composure to contain entirely. He reached across the table and covered her free hand with his. "I am glad you are the one," he said. "I am glad every single day." The stars came out over the Copper Creek Ranch, as they did every clear night in the New Mexico desert, in that complete and breathtaking abundance that made the sky look like a river of light. The creek ran full and soft in the dark. The horses stood quietly in the stable. The children slept in their rooms, all 5 of them. Eliza with her essay drafts, and Thomas with his mechanical drawings, and Ruth with her alphabet cards, and James curled around his stuffed horse, and little Margaret with her arms flung wide in the absolute abandon of a sleeping toddler. And in the kitchen of the house that Daniel had built one fence post and one season at a time, in the warm lamplight with a new baby between them and 4 years of a real life behind them, and every year ahead still open and still theirs, Cora Ford Hunter held her husband's hand across the kitchen table and knew, with the whole of herself, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the world had been kind to her. It had not, particularly. Not because she had not suffered or lost or carried things too heavy for one person. She had done all of those things and would do them again in some form, because that was simply the nature of a life lived all the way through. But because she had kept going, because Margaret had believed in her, because 3 children had needed someone to stand up and say, "This is mine, and I will not be moved," and because a man with room in his heart and his home and his life had said so plainly and meant it, she would teach Eliza everything she knew. She would watch Thomas build whatever magnificent thing he was going to build. She would let Ruth's laughter fill the house the way it did, the way Margaret's had. She would watch James grow into whatever he was, fearless and loud and entirely himself. She would watch little Margaret come into her own, red-haired and quiet-eyed and full of a life not yet begun. She would hold Henry and know that the worst years of her life had not been the last word. And she would ride out with Daniel on Saturday to look at the north pasture and talk about water access and fence lines and the next season's plans. And she would sit beside him on the porch in the evening and tell him the truth when it mattered and let him tell her his. And she would sleep beside him in the dark of the New Mexico desert, knowing that she was known and loved by someone who had chosen her fully, who had seen all of it and said yes. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, Cora Ford Hunter thought, in the particular warm and certain language of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, everything.